In the last few years, the US has imposed sweeping restrictions on exporting advanced artificial intelligence, AI, chips to China. The goal was to slow China's access to cutting-edge semiconductors, especially NVIDIA's top GPUs, on national security grounds. But NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang now calls these measures a failure, saying they have cost American companies billions in lost sales. But is that really the full story? To understand where Jensen Huang is at, let's first start with these export rules. Beginning in October 2022, the US tightened export rules on advanced computing chips and equipment sold to China. For example, in October 2022, the US banned sales to China of NVIDIA's flagship A100H100 GPUs and similar high-end chips. It also imposed new licensing requirements for chip-making machinery and other advanced ICs to prevent military-civil fusion technologies. These steps aim to restrict the PRC's ability to purchase and manufacture certain high-end chips critical for military advantage. Since then, the rules have been expanded and reinforced through multiple rounds. In October 2023, Commerce issued another package of rules to close loopholes and tighten enforcement. This expansion specifically banned the export of NVIDIA's downgraded China-specific chips, the slower A800 and H800, that had been developed to comply with the first ban. In sum, US policy made two key cuts in 2022 to 2023. 1. No direct exports of top-tier AI GPUs, H100, A100, etc., to China or Hong Kong, and 2. No exports of the China-specific mid-tier variants, H800A, 800 either. These actions were all justified on national security grounds. Former Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo said the goal was to shut off pathways for Chinese military projects to obtain advanced AI chips. Former Undersecretary Alan Estevez similarly noted the rules target China's military-civil fusion and advanced weapon systems. So the intent is not to punish civilian firms per se, but to slow China's ability to use American-made chips in anything from surveillance to military AI. However, ever since Donald Trump came into office, some news reports have popped up saying that Trump's administration is planning to rescind some export curbs on AI chips to China and replace them with its own restrictions. In fact, the Biden administration announced an AI diffusion rule in January 2025, which would formally implement a tiered licensing framework. China in Tier 3, meaning effectively barred. However, this rule, never actually in effect, was immediately slated for reversal by the incoming administration. In May 2025, NVIDIA's Huang praised President Trump's intention to scrap the tiered regime, arguing the old approach was flawed. So, why is Biden's export controls wrong? One can look at it from the views of NVIDIA. The US export controls have hit NVIDIA significantly of all American tech firms. NVIDIA dominates the AI GPU market, and China used to be a huge chunk of its sales. Before any bans, NVIDIA held roughly 90 to 95% of China's high-end AI GPU market. When President Biden took office, Huang estimates NVIDIA's China share was about 95%, but with the export curbs that plunged to roughly 50%. In plain terms, half of NVIDIA's Chinese AI customers vanished after the restrictions. Those missing sales translate directly into lost revenue. NVIDIA's own filings confirm a massive hit. In April 2025, the company said it would take a $5.5 billion charge against earnings due to the license requirement on its China-bound H20 chip. On an earnings call, Huang added that about $15 billion of potential H2O sales would be foregone under the new rules. And in a later interview, he bluntly stated that US chip curbs on China cost American companies billions of dollars in lost sales. Put simply, NVIDIA itself has described these restrictions as a multi-billion-dollar setback. Analysts note that China's importance to NVIDIA is enormous. China was roughly 13 to 15% of NVIDIA's total revenue, and the Chinese cloud giants, Alibaba, Tencent, ByteDance, were stocking up on NVIDIA's AI chips to build their own giant language models. When Washington cut off the supply, Nvidia reported a steep fall-off in demand. It even left $2.5 billion of revenue on the table in a single quarter due to H20 being blocked. Beyond revenue totals, the curbs forced Nvidia to scramble technologically. As the Reuters investigation reported, Nvidia has repeatedly had to re-engineer its chips for China. After the 2022 ban on H100, Nvidia created the slower H800 for China, and later an H20 variant. But US officials effectively shut down each workaround. They required a license even for the H20 as of 2025. Nvidia is now designing yet another downgraded Blackwell chip with less advanced memory just to satisfy the rules. This innovation under duress approach is costly and complex, illustrating how the curbs upended Nvidia's product plans. Nvidia isn't the only US firm feeling the pain. AMD, which sells its own AI accelerators, the Instinct GPU series, is similarly exposed. China makes up about a quarter of AMD's revenue. In May 2025, AMD warned investors that US restrictions on GPU exports would shave roughly $1.5 billion off its 2025 revenue. Like Nvidia, AMD adapted by offering China-limited versions of its chips, but those too now require licenses. As CEO Lisa Su noted on a call, China accounts for 24% of AMD's sales, and the new licensing rules for her Instinct chips will hit AMD's second and third quarter sales. On the same call, analysts calculated that without the controls, AMD's Q2 2025 forecast would have been much higher, on the order of $8.1 billion, instead of the actual $7.4 billion guidance. Meanwhile, even chipmakers not traditionally focused on AI are adapting. In April 2025, Intel privately informed its Chinese customers that some of its own AI processors, specifically its Gaudi AI accelerators, now need an export license if they exceed certain performance. Under the new rule, any chip with DRAM bandwidth over 1400 gigabytes per second, or I/O above 1100 gigabytes per second, can't be sold to China without permission. This affects not only Intel's Gaudi series, but also Nvidia's H20 and likely future chips. Intel declined to comment, but by publicly requiring licenses, it effectively acknowledged that some of its products are now off-limits to China. In short, the big US GPU players, Nvidia, AMD, and even Intel, have seen major parts of their China business cut off. The economic fallout for US firms extends beyond these companies' internal guidance. A Federal Reserve Bank report found that after the October 2022 export rules, affected US chip firms saw statistically significant drops in revenue, profitability, and credit availability. In other words, cutting off the Chinese market drained revenue that the companies couldn't easily make up elsewhere. Industry analysts note that China was a huge growth opportunity. Nvidia CEO Huang called it a roughly $50 billion AI market next year, and now US firms can't touch most of it. This has had national-scale effects on trade data. The US-China Business Council reports that US semiconductor exports to China plunged in 2022. One summary notes that semiconductor shipments from the US fell by about $2.9 billion in 2022 alone, wiping out what had been a growth trend. In particular, states like Oregon, home to Intel, saw a $1.8 billion drop in 2022 chip exports, largely due to the new controls. Overall, even after the bans, the US still shipped $11.2 billion in chips to China in 2022, making chips the second largest US export to China. But that was down from $14.2 billion. In 2021, analysts emphasized that many Chinese buyers are now deprioritizing American products when there are viable substitutes. So the curbs have definitely dented US tech exports. In summary, American tech companies have clearly paid a steep price. Nvidia, AMD, and others have forecast or recorded multi-billion-dollar losses. Nvidia approximately $5.5 to $15 billion, AMD $1.5 billion, because the Chinese market shrank. Even a neutral analysis found falls in revenue and profits after the rules took effect. These losses are one major reason why Huang calls the controls fundamentally flawed and a failure. But the picture isn't black and white. Supporters of the controls argue that a certain amount of American pain may be worth paying to slow China's tech advance. That debate is at the heart of the question we now examine. Have the sanctions actually curbed China's chip capabilities, or have they backfired? Well, official data shows a drop in Chinese chip imports. In 2023, China bought 479.5 billion chip units, worth $349.4 billion, a 15.4% value decline from 2022. Some of that drop reflects China's economic slowdown, weaker smartphone sales. But analysts agree export curbs played a role. For example, China's imports of basic commodity chips fell nearly 24% by volume as domestic alternatives picked up slack. In short, China did import fewer chips in 2023 than expected, which is partly due to efforts to boost local output. However, broader data suggests China's overall chip access remains largely intact. A Federal Reserve study points out that Chinese chip imports fell sharply right after the sanctions, but have since more or less tracked the pre-pandemic trend. The Fed note shows that before 2022, China's chip imports were surging. After sanctions, they dipped, but then rebounded. Today, China still imports around the same total as if there had been no slump in 2023. The reason? US curbs mostly target cutting-edge chips, but China imports huge volumes of mature chips for cars, phones, appliances that are still available globally. The Fed analysis observes that US sanctions left China's access to legacy chips, which comprise the bulk of Chinese chip imports, largely unaffected. In fact, China has become the world's top chip fabrication capacity globally in terms of wafer outputs, although most of that is for older node technology. But anyway, do let us know what you think. Thanks for watching.